which is should be a no-brainer, but for some reason, I don't know why, free market people often imagine the labor markets are just as free as they would be in a free market, which is emphatically untrue. I mean, we all know people who are sort of desperately trapped in jobs they don't like. It's a very strange situation. You think you'd be like a market failure. Like, why are you in a job you don't like? It doesn't make any sense. It's a situation called job lock. I think what's happened is that on the free market ride, people have underestimated the extent to which the labor markets are seriously intervened with by federal rules and regulations. The most egregious of which, and there's so many of these things, but the most egregious of which, the most obvious of which, is healthcare. Why healthcare should have anything to do with employment, it's not at all obvious, and the situation came about, entrenched further by Obamacare, of course, which is basically a fascist corporate ploy to subsidize the insurance industry and the medical industrial complex. But the whole thing came about in the waning days of World War II as a result of wage controls. Large corporations could not hire people above a certain wage. All wages were set by the federal government. So the largest corporations began to pay in the form of benefits rather than wages. One of them was healthcare, which is a nice workaround, a typical kind of black market workaround to federal positions. Unfortunately, what happens a lot of time in an overly corporatized economy, these same firms that implemented healthcare for their workers began to lobby for them to be mandatory across the full spectrum of the industrial sector as a way of imposing higher costs on the competition. We have to understand the way this dynamic works. Anytime large corporations are arguing for government intervention, it's usually as a way of punishing their competition and cartelizing their role in the industrial sector, getting rid of competition and replacing it with a cartel-style arrangement. That's essentially what happened with healthcare. And gradually, over the decades, culminating in Obamacare, we saw the mandates intensify for any firms above a certain size have to provide healthcare for workers. Well, contrary to what the left says, this has nothing to do with the rights of workers. In fact, it is the exact opposite. So many people feel trapped in their jobs because they fear leaving for what's going to happen to them if they should lose their healthcare benefits. They're not really genuinely portable in the way that people think. So they stick around, just as in jobs they hate, with bosses they hate, and oppressive situations that they loathe, just so they can preserve their healthcare benefits, which are not really free, of course they're paying for them themselves. So that's a major intervention, and it causes the labor markets to be free. Another very interesting sort of feature of the unfree market is the whole W-2 system, whereby the employer collects withholding taxes in the course of the year, and these taxes are paid back. If you paid more than you're supposed to, then you're given it back in the form of a tax return, which many people regard as being some sort of great gift from the government. In fact, it's the opposite. It's sort of a payment back for elites that have stolen too much. Essentially, that's really all it is. But psychologically, this is seen as by many workers as somehow a benefit to them. The W-2 employment system is a guarantee that the state's going to get everything it wants from you, no matter what. It has nothing to do with the free market, and again, it causes a kind of job lock. Other forms of intervention, of course, include the sort of corporatized labor union system, which is not as relevant anymore in the private sector as it once was, but is still relevant in the public sector. You'll notice that a lot of these interventions came about during World War II and after. That was really the beginning of the end for the free labor markets. What are the effects of these kinds of interventions? What they do is they give the boss, or the owners of capital, inordinate power they would not otherwise have in a real free market. In a real free market, there ought to be free bargaining between laborers and capital. There should not be more power to capital than to labor, or vice versa. It should be a perfect exchange, just like any other exchange. When you go to the convenience store and buy a candy bar, it's a free exchange that takes place, and it should be the same way in labor markets. But it's not. How egregious is this? It's tremendously egregious. In Mises's great book, 1927 book called Liberalism, he said a defining mark of liberalism, of the free society, is that labor and capital have no more power over each other, and don't have any inordinate power over each other. They have free bargaining. Well, that was true, maybe, more or less, in 1927. It's certainly not true today. All these interventions designed to supposedly help labor have, in fact, massively empowered capital to the point that it's almost has a kind of coercive power, and exactly the way the Marxist morality plays, might describe it. But let me back up in time and go back to the progressive era, because I think this gets very interesting. I recently did a study on the origin of minimum wages. I don't know how many of you read it. Did anybody read it? Did you see that? Yeah, you read it.
Racist.
This is on eugenics, and it's the racist origins of the minimum wage. Yeah,
I heard about it.
Yeah. So this was very intriguing to me because I had read an article that came out several years ago in the Journal of Economic Perspectives that was highlighting many journal articles that came out in between, say, 1913 and 1920 about the minimum wage, that highlighted comments by economists saying that the purpose of the minimum wage really is to exclude workers from the workforce, that we had too many people getting into the workforce who didn't belong there. The wrong kinds of people were making money, entering into professional life and having their lives subsidized in some way by the professional life. And they were propagating children. And this was a serious problem. And the purpose of the minimum wage was to set a very high barrier to entry into the workforce, to exclude these inferior populations. Well, I mean, that's fairly harrowing and interesting, but what I did was I went to his citations and I reread all the original articles that he had cited. And it's far worse than the author initially imagined. It's so grim, like you can't believe it. In terms of race and ethnicity, there's an outright exterminationist agenda going on here. Excluding blacks was just a no-brainer. That's just what they had to do. But when they talked about the preservation of race, which they use those terms, we have to preserve the race. What they're really talking about is sort of the elite ruling class Anglo-Saxon ethnicities of the Northeast, basically. Everybody else was excluded. Irish immigrants, Italian immigrants, these were considered not part of the race. They had to go. So in denying them access to jobs was one way that they can enact a eugenics policy. Eugenics was, of course, an orthodoxy of the period of the Progressive Era. Every important intellectual believed in it. Mandatory sterilization, extermination in one generation. I'm not talking about Nazis here. We're talking about important literary figures like the incredibly monstrous and egregious and disgusting human being called T.S. Eliot. A man I just loathe to my very core. I don't know if you read his stuff, but the founder of modernism as a literary genre was basically genocidal in his longing for exterminating non-elite groups, and of course would have been advocate for minimum wages. The leading economics textbook at the time was by Frank Tapsig. It came out in 1907, and it remained the top-selling economics book up to about 1925. It has an entire chapter in there on the minimum wage. And you can read it, you can download it online and see exactly what he says. What he says is, we have a problem with inferiors reproducing themselves at a dramatic rate. And we need to do something about it, as everybody understands. We cannot yet chloroform as we should. But at the very least, we can deny them admission to the workforce. That was his thinking. And he was hardly alone. I mean, he's speaking for an orthodoxy. It wasn't announcing some shocking new policy. This is speaking for a class, essentially a ruling class, that was very anxious to shut down the world. Another very interesting feature of this that was not in the original article that I found only once doing the reading some of the source material is that there was a widespread cultural panic about the role of women in particular in society, which had began to change dramatically over the last quarter century of the 19th century, the last 25 years of the 19th century. We saw an unparalleled empowerment of women as workers, leaving their homesteads, moving to the cities, earning income for the first time, experiencing real power, and becoming full-right citizens of humanity, essentially for the first time in history. It was the end of subjugation of women. But also, very crucially and importantly, not just as laborers and producers, but as consumers. This is what was driving the ruling class absolutely nuts, because women were giving birth to all kinds of new industries and sectors of life that previously hadn't existed as far as the ruling class is concerned, taking away from the really important stuff like heavy industry, and instead turning society's scarce resources over to production of frippery things like silk stockings, popular novels, newspapers, films, which the women were the main consumers of films, and the cosmetics industry, which was the ruling patriarch at the time considered to be mysterious. Men have always had a very strange issue with regard to cosmetics. I don't know why this is, but men don't get them or understand them. Every misogynistic movement in the history of the world has always taken after cosmetics as being a great evil that needs to be stamped out from Tertullian in the 3rd century, all the way up to Stefan Nolan today. Cosmetics are a big issue. So they were panicked at the rise of the cosmetics industry, which was gigantic and really given birth at the turn of the 20th century. So part of the purpose of the minimum wage was to discourage women from entering into the workforce, not just because women were unwelcome, and the industries that were hiring women were a competitive threat to the ruling class corporate cartel, but also because working gave women buying power, and it was this buying power that they were seeking to shut off. In fact, I've been playing around in my own mind a little bit with this, something of a mystery to me. Why is it that the total state was born mainly in the 20th century? By total state, I mean a state that acknowledges no limits to its power. There's no area of life that is untouched by the total state. And I don't mean Russia, I don't mean Germany, I mean the US, I mean practically every industrialized nation in the world adopted this model. So suddenly, like all at once, we went from more or less an age of laissez-faire from the end of Napoleonic Wars, which lasted all the way up to World War I, to suddenly having this massive crush of regulations that have taken over life, from antitrust laws to income taxes, central banking, marriage licenses, public schooling, you name it. Suddenly the state, medical regulation for the first time, food and drug regulation across the board, all of them pushed by a corporate cartel. They were conservatizing devices. They were devices designed to shut down the progress and pace of social evolution that was taking place over the previous 25 years. That was their purpose, that was their intent, that was their function, that was the result. But why did it happen? Why then? And I think a lot of it has to do with the problem of women's advancement. This was a serious issue for that generation. They were panicked and they were worried about what was going to happen in a society where women were no longer systematically subjugated, but rather had their own power. So why do you need a total state? Well, here's the thing. If you have a genocidal eugenics, planning style mentality, you can deal with ethnic minorities through things like Jim Crow laws or internment camps or separation and segregation. You can push them to the outer edges of the social order and reserve just the main staples of life for the ruling class. Women, on the other hand, you can't get rid of them in the same way. You've got to have a much more intrusive system of state imposition and despotism in order to stop women's advancement, because you can't actually segregate them demographically in the way you can segregate racial minorities and others. So you have to construct what's essentially a total total state takeover of all aspects of society. I think that was probably more than anything else one of the main driving forces. There are many driving forces behind the construction of the total state, but this has to be one, and it's one that's not talked about much at all. And when you reflect on this, you wonder how it comes to be. Two very strange features that I don't understand. One is that why is it that people who love liberty are not friendlier and more sympathetic to the feminist agenda, for one thing. That's a no-brainer. Feminism and laissez-faire rose up together. It was laissez-faire that gave rise to women's empowerment. So libertarians should, I think, change their attitudes towards feminism generally. The second strange thing is how it is that feminism, as we understand it today, has become basically friendly to the state. It actually makes no sense whatsoever. The state has always been the enemy of women at all times and all places, and especially in the 20th century. So it doesn't actually make much sense to me. Some of this research, I think, it also calls on us to rethink what it is we want, what freedom really looks like, and what the state really looks like. And this has been a big transformation in my own thinking. I'm not so sure I would call it a transformation, but I would suggest that it's shifted my outlook a little bit, or maybe crystallized it a little bit more. There are two ways to think about freedom. And we all have in our minds what we imagine freedom really looks like. Like, we look around our world today, it's full of artificiality, strangeness, and things that bother us. And we have in our minds maybe a vision of what the world would look like under freedom that we want to work towards. This, I believe, should be heavily informed by the only experience that really modernity's ever had with anything approaching that laissez-faire idea. And that is the 19th century. Essentially, the years between, as I say, 1810 and the beginning of World War I. What is the defining characteristic of that period in history? And what is it that was different about that time versus every other time? Well, you can see it in the demographics. You can chart, and anthropologists and demographers have charted all of history from 3000 BC all the way up till the 19th century, and largely it looks like a long flat line in terms of per capita income, lifespan, and population. And then suddenly everything changed. Everything went wild. And the line looks like they call it a hockey stick. It shoots up to the sky. Unbelievable skyrocketing of income and of lifespans, and decline in infant mortality. And the demographics of the world began to shift hugely and dramatically in a way that is absolutely marvelous to behold. I think today we look at charts like that and we're like, oh my God, humanity discovered the secret to progress. Humanity has, for the first time, figured out what enables people to become wealthy. Why didn't we stick with it? Why was everybody not just celebrating? Well, I think what that kind of analysis forgets is what I've recently discovered, which is that the ruling class didn't like it one bit. For them, it was the end of an era, and it caused widespread cultural panic. I mentioned T.S. Eliot earlier, but there's also D.H. Lawrence and H.G. Wells and a whole class of intellectuals teaching at Ivy League universities in the UK and the US. They saw what happened in the late 19th century as the biggest disaster in the history of the world. Their streets of major cities used to be men with top hats and women in petticoats. Everything's beautiful, everything's orderly. The poor would die young. Most of their children would not make it past the age of 1, and life was good. Their corporations lasted. They had the system locked down for themselves. And and then everything went wild. Just practically overnight, as far as they were concerned. The wrong people were getting rich. Immigrants would move to this country and suddenly make giant, wonderful businesses for themselves. Income was rising, infant mortality was falling, healthcare was becoming available to the masses, education was spreading all over the place. It was a big problem for the ruling class at the time. They didn't like the fact that immigrant populations were going to be educated. This is a disaster. For one thing, they hated newspapers. This is another story entirely. It's very strange how much they hated newspapers. This is the origin of modernism literature, is to write as opaquely and obscurely as possible, so that the masses couldn't understand it. Also the origin of modern classical music in the turn of the 20th century. Why atonal music became very popular and so on. But anyway, all that aside, what we saw was a gigantic cultural upheaval that resulted from laissez-faire. A constant and unending circulation of elites. People who had presumed to be powerful suddenly were not powerful. Groups that previously had been marginalized throughout all of human history suddenly became wealthy and became serious players in the social order, and it led to a massive panic. So I think in light of this history, we need to change our conception about what freedom is. I would say that freedom is a system by which we have a constant and unending circulation of elites, so that no one group gets in control, and so that marginalized populations have a real shot at experiencing their full humanity in the biggest, most vigorous, beautiful ways. That's my conception of what freedom really looks like. Now, on the other hand, what is the state and what does it do? I think we can take a cue by looking at the progressive era and see what it was all about. The progressive era was not really about progress. It wasn't even about socialism. What it was about was a ruling class using the tools of power to exploit the masses of people who were making such advances materially and socially. That's the essence of the origins of the state. In other words, the state is, by its very nature, a conservative institution. It is not a progressive institution. It is not a revolutionary institution. It is a conservatizing device to keep the ruling class perpetuating itself and fend off the advancements from previously marginalized populations. I think this is the right way to think about what the state is. And if you understand that, you'll understand the headlines a lot more. This is not a story that the left tells, obviously, right? And it's not a story that the right tells either. I mean, the left is always promoting the government as this great empowerment, this tool to empower the poor, right? And then the right says, oh no, this is very bad. We shouldn't allow the masses, democratic masses, to loot productive people. Well, they're both lying to you, you know? Neither one is true. The state is not the tool by which the have-nots take from the haves. The state is the tool by which the haves try to retain as much power as they can to preserve the incumbent power of the ruling class and to keep the masses from encroaching on what they think is their rightful territory. If you understand that, you understand almost everything that's going on in government today. You understand Obamacare, you understand net neutrality, you understand almost everything you read in the papers. And I think this is a different way to conceptualize this. So what does it mean for our times in the 21st century? Well, for one thing, it means this. The total state as it came to be born in the progressive era is really a parenthesis in history. It's an unsustainable reality. It's something that was an experiment that has not worked because it's contrary to human nature. We don't want to live in cages. We won't live in cages. Black markets are pervasive all over the world, as never before. Non-compliance with the regime is a defining mark of the social and economic trends of our time. It is falling apart. It is no longer working. They can't keep us in cages, and we will not let them. The great invention of the distributed network, I think, is the weapon that we are going to use to dismantle the structures of power. Every state has two defining marks. It can only deal with a world of physical coercion, and it can only operate within a geographic jurisdiction that's defined according to space. The distributed network and the digital realm generally operates outside of the physical world, and it massively evades geography. So it's a global institution that lives on top of and outside the realm of physical world. That takes away the two critical powers that the state has, all in one fell swoop. And I think this is why the world is changing so dramatically and so quickly. 2008 saw the invention of the smartphone that gave rise to the app economy. The app economy is the way by which we're engaging with each other peer-to-peer. We think of it as a very modern system. It is, but it's also a restoration of the progress we were experiencing at the end of the 19th century. Things were going so well for us. We shut it down. We implemented a massive total state and started the world's first total war and destroyed that freedom. 100 years later, we can see the results. Mass catastrophe. We're also seeing mass efforts to break free from the system. What does this mean for workers? That's very, very interesting, actually. In the app economy today, the rules no longer apply. People from any age can go to work and make money. Child labor laws, again, I don't need to describe to you anymore what they were. They were a tool by the ruling class to exclude poor people from the workplace. Child labor laws are no longer applying in an app economy. You know, if you've got some technical skills, you can go to work at the age of 12 or 13. Well, how do you get paid? How do you get paid under these conditions? Well, that's where cryptocurrency comes in, right? So we're disintermediating at such an extraordinary pace that we no longer even need to use the government's own nationalized money. That's extraordinary. And how fast is the pace of progress taking place? Extraordinarily quickly. We are on the verge of seeing a whole series of new technologies built on top of the blockchain that are enabling us to use the blockchain to identify property titles, for example, to our cars and our homes and land, and even contract marriages on the blockchain in a way that is non-forgeable, non-reproducible, and global, and truly verifiable, completely outside the government court system. All of this is happening in our time, and so quickly, just within the last 6 years. It's an amazing pace of change. And we're just at the beginnings of it, really. I can't wait to see what's going to happen over the next 5 or 10 years. What is the point of all of this innovation? The point is to restore and build freedom as one generation began to know it. We got a glimpse of it, and then we turned the other direction. We're starting to see a rebuilding of liberty through digital technology that I think is going to empower people as never before. The purpose is to build a world of true global worker empowerment, where there's no longer this massive disparities between capital and labor, but rather where every individual, regardless of geography, regardless of station in life, has a true chance to build a wonderful life for themselves. We're through the 20th century, the century of the total state, and we're entering into a new age of peer-to-peer engagement, where we truly experience, ironically, that dream once stated by Woodrow Wilson, a dream of self-determination for the entire world. We're getting it now, finally. It's not coming from a president. It's coming from the ground up through revolutionary, non-compliant, agorist economics and technological innovation. So thank you very much. Glad to take any questions. Yes?
You sound like those pinkos over at C4SS.
Really?
I'm just kidding.
I'm an anarcho-capitalist. Don't call me that.
No,
I don't think that left and right really pertain anymore. I don't believe that either side has the story. The story, in the end, is a story about the struggle of the masses of people against a ruling class that uses exploitative state means to keep us down. I think if you understand that, you understand everything you need to know about the world. This has been a hard truth for me to realize. It's taken me better part of 20 years of study and understanding. The three books that have really influenced me most profoundly in my conception of this stuff is Gabriel Coco's great book, Triumph of Conservatism. This is a great history of the progressive era. If you haven't read it, you should look at it. The second one is John Kerry's book, Intellectuals and the Masses, which is a history of the intelligentsia's reaction to the progress we were making in the 19th century and their genocidal plots to destroy humanity, essentially everybody but themselves. It's a terrifying, nightmarish of a work. It just will keep you up in horror and shock. The third great book is Martin van Crevel, who's an Israeli historian, called The Rise and Decline of the State. And it's a history of the gradual emergence of the state in the 20th century, dating back from the personal states of the early Middle Ages, up through the advent of the nation state and the Renaissance, all the way up through the 20th century. And he marks off that great day in human history where the state began to lose confidence in itself, and he believes it's on the way to decline. That book came out about 15 years ago, but I highly recommend it. Those are the three books that I like the most. None of the three are written by libertarians, by the way. Great. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. Go ahead. Yes.
It's somewhat related, actually. So you had started your talk. You mentioned the kind of blindness of the free market right to these issues of
of labor interventions and exploitation of labor. Right.
Yeah. And so that, and then something about that, and the sort of increase of attention within the liberty movement specifically to issues of gender and race.
Right.
And not that those debates and struggles haven't always been around within the movement, at least for a very long time, but it does strike me that there's some lines being drawn in the sand within the movement, specifically in a very fundamental way around some of these issues. That different people have conceptualized somewhat differently. We've talked about the brutalist and humanitarian aspects, and other people talk about it.
Yeah, I wrote that article about this time last year.
Yeah, so I'm interested in what you see is happening on that front, because it does strike me that there is something, that there's a there that wasn't around, that these issues were not as salient, these divisions, these dividing lines were not as salient. I wouldn't want to conceptualize left versus right, I think that's too oversimplified. But even 5 years ago, within the liberty movement, I'm interested in your
well,
thoughts.
there seems to be some sort of cultural explosion taking place. And I think it's kind of unfortunate in a way. And I think it's just simply because people do not understand the history. Like the anti-feminists are reacting to conventional feminism and developing a kind of a misogynistic defense of patriarchy that is a little bit silly and embarrassing, because I don't think it has anything to do with the actual real history of women's liberation. Jack Collins' great book. If you're interested in understanding misogyny and its role in history of the world, I hope you take me seriously when I say this, because so often people throw out books out there and you're like, oh yeah, I'll get to that someday. I mean this, okay? This is a great book. It's called A Brief History of Misogyny by Jack Holland. Take it seriously. Download it from Amazon and read it. You'll see things you've never seen before. Actually, you'll begin to understand the world in a slightly different way. And that's just what's reasserting itself on the libertarian right. It's just old-fashioned misogyny. And I think it's a silly reaction, really, and pointless. That's not looking at the broad sweep of history. And it's also terribly distracting. We should never forget that our enemies are not racial minorities. Our enemies are not women. Our enemy is the state, always and everywhere. And a lot of these cultural struggles that we see within libertarianism seems to be forgetting that. As to why it's happening right now, it's hard to know because it's a chicken and egg problem. There was a movement in the 1990s. I was there. I was very good friends with Murray Rothbard during this period. I was very good friends with him between 1985 and 1995. I was there when there was a birth of a kind of a new, what was called paleo-libertarianism, it was sort of right-wing libertarianism. It came about because the end of the Cold War presented itself, and there seemed to be a real opportunity for libertarians to link up with a newly reformed right wing in America that was no longer interested in global empire. The idea is that we could put together a coalition of isolationist conservatives who could work with libertarians and develop a really strong front against the welfare warfare state. That was the idea. What actually happened was that libertarians got involved with a bunch of conservatives, and instead of the conservatives adopting libertarian views, they kind of turned the other way. And a lot of libertarians just began to adopt a lot of the culturally reactionary attitudes of the right wing. And I think it was just a tremendous mistake. And it was a mistake for very precise reasons, not just because I think it's, culturally wrong to hold racialist, misogynistic views, which it is, but I think it's historically inaccurate. It's not a fair rendering of what liberty really is. Freedom is a system of universal empowerment. That's what it was in history, and we need to embrace that. I mean, libertarians are really the one political ideology that favors the common good. I mean, the good of everybody. Not just men, not just capital, not just Westerners. It's a theory of universal good, and the common good. We need to accept that and understand that, and embrace it and run with it. I mean, it's going to require we depart from both the left and the right, but I think it's the right way to conceptualize it. So anyway, then you had, of course, the birth of the social justice warrior libertarians, which just absolutely drove the right libertarians over the top. And now the Facebook wars are, unending. I never participate in them at all because I find them, mostly tedious and distracting. A bunch of name calling, really. I don't get it. It's completely pointless, and it's mostly ignorant debates because I don't think people really understand the real history. So I hope I answered your question. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
It's an off-topic question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Do you know of the actor Tim Curry?
I think so. What did he play in?
Well, his most famous role was Frankenfurter in the Rocky Horror Picture Show.
Okay. Yeah.
You actually, your vocals sound very similar.
I knew he was going to say that.
Well, my voice isn't right today because I have the laryngitis problem.
All right, so
yeah, because normally I'm actually more pleasant to listen to. I'm a little rough today, but I woke up this morning with this laryngitis thing.
All right.
It's persisting. But I'm not sure I've ever heard that before. So, thank you. Go ahead.
Beyond racism even, there's a tendency among libertarians in their rhetoric to almost demonize poor people, especially poor people who are on welfare.
I get this.
Give it a job.
I know, and it's true for blacks too. I mean, again, I think a lot of this is confusion. People believe that, and this is true for conservatives too. They think that they imagine that the state system is the tool that the rabble and the masses are using to exploit the productive and the elites. But this is just a lie, actually. The state is the tool that the elites use to exploit the masses of people. And anything that looks different from that is an illusion created for public consumption. I mean, do we really believe that, black Americans struggled for their rights after the end of slavery for 100 years, and all the government gave them was the right to order a sandwich or something, and otherwise, constructed a mass system of incarceration and re-enslavement, and a truncated labor market that specifically excludes masses of them from any kind of productive employment. I mean, this is not black people benefiting from the government at our expense. This is a system of exploitation. the ruling class against black Americans. It's the same thing with women, you know. And if you don't believe this, you should try sometimes suing your employer for racial or sexual discrimination. It's like a joke. I mean, you'll never get anywhere. I mean, the backlog of cases at the EEOC is, you know, like 18 years or something. I mean, it's laughing. That is not what's taking place. I think it's just a misconception, you know. The right wing just looks at racial minorities and women and says, oh, look at these people that are unjustly done. The same thing is happening with gays now, right, too. They say the same thing, you know, the gays are, you know, forget 10,000 years of oppression or whatever. The real problem in the world is that some one case in Ohio or something, some guy had to bake a wedding cake for a gay wedding. This is oppression, you know, as far as the right wing is concerned. Yeah.
Or in Arizona, they actually tried to float a bill to ban transgender people from using the correct bathroom.
Yeah.
You know, they said, no, you gotta use the bathroom that's on your birth certificate.
Yeah.
Really? That's the biggest societal problem you can think of.
And to some extent, it's always a mistake to single out and say, well, this group is benefiting, this group is being harmed, you know, and to have this endless. We're all exploited by the state, every one of us. Blacks, whites, women, men, able, disabled, everybody's a victim. You know, what the state tries to do is construct these Hunger Games for us, you know, and put us all in an arena. They want us to kill each other, while President Snow, you know, relaxes in his little comfortable chair and gives everyone more power and privilege. That's what's really going on, and we should always resist this and not make enemies out of demographic groups. There's not a single person in the world who isn't going to benefit from a system of human liberty. The only exceptions are the ruling class, which is a phrase I like. I don't know how often libertarians have used that phrase, but I think it's a good description, actually, of what the state is. It's not just a state that's completely exogenous from society. It really is a tool that existing wealth holders and elites use to exploit the rest of us.
I want to actually mention, talking about transgender people in the bathroom stuff, there's this awesome recent story out of Michigan that a Planet Fitness cancels a woman's membership after her complaints of a transgender woman in the locker room. She just like kept calling the corporate office and saying, this is making me feel uncomfortable, and like, you know, they shouldn't be in here, they're clearly a man, and like, you know, this and that, and like I feel super uncomfortable. And I guess I've heard it's actually BS. Like the Planet Fitness like has a no judgment free zone. I've heard mixed things about that actually in practice. But at least in this particular circumstance, they're like, yeah, so we have that policy. If you're not going to respect that, and the woman who's complaining, she's like, I'm not going to respect that. It's like, okay, well, you know, you can cancel your membership then, you know.
Right.
And it's pretty awesome.
Instead of kicking the trans person out. Yeah,
Right, exactly.
that's the way it goes. That's the way
It's
it should
perfectly reasonable as a business to say, if you don't like the service I'm providing, then
Yeah.
pay for it.
That's right.
Not obligated to do anything. Yeah, you had asked, like, you wonder how often libertarians use the idea of the state being the management apparatus of the ruling class, which, you know, is a quote from Marx paraphrased.
Yeah.
Do you think that there is a growing synthesis or engagement between what used to be called the left, the actual left, Marxism and libertarianism, or do you think it's a rediscovery of past kind of
Well, you know, Murray tried to kind of revive a libertarian left coalition in the 1960s. My impression was it didn't go anywhere. He got very frustrated because the left, you know, has a problem with economics, you know, apparently. So this is we keep bumping into this. So I have my doubts about that. I'm not even so interested in libertarians linking arms with this or the other existing political groups. I don't know why we can't just be ourselves. I think we're making great progress, just being lovers of liberty.
Ourselves and left alone.
Yeah, right, yeah. But you know, we shouldn't forget too that the Marxists stole this idea of the ruling class from us. It was originally a classical liberal idea, used all throughout, you know, from the 17th and 18th centuries. And Marx took over this idea of class conflict from us. And he turned it into you know, he distorted it. He said that under a capitalistic economic order, there's going to be entrenched conflicts between capital and labor, which is untrue. The real conflict is between the state and the individual. So he took that from us. But even as late as 1945, Mises was writing about class conflict from a libertarian point of view. The clash of group interests is the name of his essay. Yeah, go ahead.
I keep running into things that I think are rising from the puritanical past of America. You know, almost all the sexual politics and the, you know, this gender stuff and the, you know, they get incensed about things that really are none of their friggin' business, you know, because they're things sexual. You know, I think there'd be a whole lot less abortions if we didn't have this puritanical background.
Well, speaking of Puritanism and abortion, you know, I mean, why don't we have a vigorous market for child-rearing rights? That would solve the abortion problem if you think about it. Very quickly, we've got a massive oversupply of children, you know, and a huge underserved demand for children, you know, and they're almost like exactly matched. So what's going on with the market? That these are being killed and these are being unmet. That we don't have a market for child-rearing rights.
Imagine.
I mean, it's actually illegal to pay a woman to bear a child for you. It is. It's illegal. You can pay her out-of-pocket expenses, but you can't pay her opportunity costs.
That comes
You can't make it remunerative.
right out of a religious
It does.
suppressive past.
No, and you know, I once asked a priest. I said, who's an he's a pro-life protester.
Sure.
I asked a priest. I said, what if I told you that we could get rid of abortion in this country with an active market for child-rearing rights? Would you go for it? And he didn't understand it. So once I explained, he goes, "Oh, that is morally intolerable. We can't ever allow the selling of children. That's outrageous." I said, "So you think it's better for a child to be killed than sold?" He said, "Yes."
Oh.
I mean, it was
recently
usually
met
stands.
a really devout Irish Catholic from Ireland.
Right.
On the way. And she's great, and we get along great, but, I mean, we get into these discussions about abortion and what have you.
Well, I should say that I'm Catholic too, so to some extent bound, you know, by the Church's teachings on these matters. But I think in the end, abortion is a matter of jurisdiction. You know, where you're going to place the decision.
I was raised by Lutherans, so it's a lot of stuff away. But my point was that I said to her that the right answer is take away all of the people's, you know, don't take them away, but redirect these people's resources for and against life and abortion and whatever, and apply it to creating a viable fetus transplant.
Yeah.
I mean, why shouldn't medical technology come up with that?
Right. I mean, we should never forget that this is a batshit crazy country. This is really important to remember. This is the country where we tried to ban the production and distribution of all alcohol.
On the subject,
Well,
We gotta wrap it up. We gotta wrap up. We're kind of running out of time.
and I have to make another introduction actually here shortly. So,
Yeah. But thank you so much for talking. It's
yeah,
been-
thank you so much for having me.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.